My parents invited me and my daughter to Thanksgiving, but while my sister and her kids ate turkey with the family, we were shoved to a side table. My mother laughed. Be grateful we even gave you a seat. My daughter got cold mashed potatoes. I took her hand and left. Hours later, my phone was flooded with missed calls. I never answered. In the morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, she wore hospital scrubs with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Having worked as a nurse at the local hospital for 15 years, her hands moved with a stability and gentleness born from years of experience. Sophie, time to get up. Breakfast is ready, she called. In response, the sound of footsteps running down the stairs could be heard. Her 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, had her mother's bright brown hair and the blue eyes of her father, James, from whom Laura was currently separated. Good morning, Mom, Sophie said, sitting at the table and reaching for the pancakes. Laura had prepared. Only 2 more days until Thanksgiving break. Are we going to Grandma and Grandpa's house? Laura paused before answering. Yes, Grandma invited us this year. It was actually the first invitation in 3 years. Laura's relationship with her parents had always been complicated, especially with her mother, Margaret. Raised as the daughter of a successful Wall Street banker, Margaret was pretentious and valued social status above all else. In contrast, her father, Henry, came from a typical middle-class background and had led a stable life as a university professor but rarely opposed his wife's opinions due to his indecisive nature. When Laura answered the phone, it was the hospital calling. Can you start your shift 2 hours earlier today? Maria isn't feeling well. Of course, I'll be right there, she replied, hanging up. Laura looked at Sophie. I'm sorry, sweetie, but I need to leave a little early today. Trisha's mom will pick you up after school. I should be home by 7. Sophie nodded, accustomed to the situation. In her own way, she understood that her mother worked hard to raise her alone. As Laura started the car engine, she found herself lost in thought. She remembered the day 5 years ago when her relationship with her husband, James, deteriorated and he moved to another city in what they called a temporary assignment. Though they hadn't divorced, they were taking their time considering the possibility of reconciliation. James worked busy hours as a construction site supervisor, but came to see Sophie every weekend. Recently, their relationship had been improving gradually, and he had let her know he would join them at her parents' house for Thanksgiving after finishing work. Laura collected herself and drove to work. Her job at the hospital was busy, but she attended to each patient with care and a warm smile. Her colleagues trusted her, and the hospital director highly valued her work. On her way home, Laura received a call from her sister, Rachel. Laura, you're coming for Thanksgiving, right? Mom's worried again. At 42, Rachel was a partner at a well-known local law firm, having received all the love and affection from their parents, especially their mother. Her position within the family was stable, unlike Laura's. Yes, I'm coming. James will be joining us later too. James too? Are you two getting back together? There was obvious surprise in Rachel's voice. I'm not sure yet, but we're talking about trying again for Sophie's sake. I see. Rachel's response was ambiguous. Anyway, let's meet on Thursday. Ethan and Lily are looking forward to it. With a 12-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter, Rachel valued having the whole family together for Thanksgiving each year. However, Laura never felt that her sister truly welcomed her or her niece, Sophie. When she got home, Sophie had already been dropped off by Trisha's mother and was doing her homework. Laura stroked Sophie's head and began discussing preparations for Thanksgiving. What should we bring to Grandma's? How about a traditional pumpkin pie and maybe an album with your photos? Yes, Sophie's eyes sparkled. I want to show them my school project photos too. Laura smiled, but there was still a shadow of anxiety in her eyes. She recalled what had happened at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. She had been hurt by her mother's cold attitude then, but this year she wanted to create good memories, especially for Sophie. As she was getting out ingredients for the pie in the kitchen, Laura's cell phone rang. It was James. Laura, I'll be a little late the day after tomorrow, but I'll definitely be there. Please give my regards to Sophie. Thank you, James. Sophie's looking forward to it. After hanging up, Laura took a deep breath. Throughout the years of enduring family friction, Sophie's presence had always been her support. She was determined to get through this Thanksgiving with a smile for her daughter's sake. On Thanksgiving morning, Laura checked her outfit in the mirror several times. She had chosen a gentle blue dress with a simple silver necklace. Sophie wore her favorite red dress, her hair adorned with small braids her mother had plaited. "You look lovely, Sophie," Laura said, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "The pie for Grandma is ready too." The two of them loaded the homemade pumpkin pie and carefully selected presents into the car. After a 30-minute drive, they arrived at her parents' house in an affluent Boston suburb. The spacious two-story stone mansion spoke of its owner's wealth through its refined appearance. "Smile, Sophie," Laura whispered before pressing the doorbell. Her mother, Margaret, opened the door. Even at 65, she hadn't lost her elegance, wearing pearl necklaces and an expensive tweed ensemble. "Oh, you've arrived early." Margaret's words of welcome lacked warmth. "Hello, Mother." "Thank you for inviting us," Laura responded with a tense smile. "Hello, Grandma," Sophie greeted cheerfully. Margaret merely patted Sophie's head lightly before leading them into the house. In the living room, her sister, Rachel, and her family, along with Henry and other relatives, were already chatting. "Hello, Rachel, Daniel." Laura greeted her sister's husband as well. Rachel hurriedly gave her a kiss on the cheek before immediately returning to her conversation with another relative. Her children, though noticing Sophie, made no effort to approach her. Only Henry stood up to give Laura and Sophie welcoming hugs. "I'm glad you came," Henry whispered in Laura's ear. "I'm sorry for being a weak father." Laura's heart ached at her father's words, but she didn't show it in her expression. Taking Sophie's hand, she offered the gifts they had brought. "Mother, these are our Thanksgiving presents." I included photos of Sophie's school projects too. Margaret simply accepted them and placed them on the table. Speaking of which, have you heard about Rachel's children's performance in the national mock trial competition? Ethan placed first in the state. As time passed, Laura and Sophie sat quietly in a corner of the living room. There seemed to be no opening for them to join the surrounding conversations, and they felt isolated. Sophie tried several times to talk to her cousins, but they were engrossed in adult topics and showed no interest in her. Finally, it was time for dinner. In the dining room, a large oak table was gorgeously decorated with candles and flowers. Henry entered with a traditional turkey and began preparing to carve it. As relatives took their seats one after another, Laura and Sophie were also looking for places to sit. Just as Sophie approached a chair near her cousins, Margaret intervened. "You two will sit over there." She pointed to a small side table placed in a sort of hallway between the kitchen and dining room. The cheap folding table with visible joints had only two plastic chairs beside it. The color drained from Laura's face. Rachel and her family were seated at the grand dining table with their parents and other relatives, while she and Sophie were relegated to a separate area. "Why can't we sit with everyone else?" Sophie voiced an honest question. Margaret shrugged with a somewhat mocking expression. "You should be grateful I prepared seats for you at all." Those words cut through Laura's heart like a knife. Henry looked visibly uncomfortable with his wife's behavior but said nothing and continued carving the turkey. Laura took Sophie's hand and headed toward the side table. She felt like her heart was breaking seeing her daughter's hurt expression, but she tried to maintain a smile. As service began, the people at the main table were served warm turkey, plenty of gravy, and crispy baked casseroles one after another. However, the plates brought to Laura and Sophie contained only cold mashed potatoes and a few vegetables. "Mom," Sophie called in a small voice. "Is this all?" Laura felt sadness and anger welling up inside her, the cold treatment from her mother since childhood, the unequal treatment compared to her sister, and now the reality that it extended even to her beloved daughter. Sophie had tears in her eyes. At 10 years old, she could sense the unfairness of the situation. In that moment, something within Laura transformed into determination. She slowly stood up and took Sophie's hand. "Sophie, let's go." The living room fell silent instantly. Laura handed Sophie a small note, gently saying, "Don't forget to give this to Grandma." "Thank you, but we're done here," Laura said in a voice that wasn't directed at anyone in particular but was loud enough for everyone to hear. Sophie followed her mother's instructions, walking up to her grandmother and handing her the note. Before Margaret could say anything, Laura had already pulled Sophie toward the entrance. The sound of the door closing echoed throughout the house. Margaret tried to hide her disturbed expression, quickly making excuses to the relatives. She always overreacts, but everyone felt the heaviness in the air. Henry sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Rachel said nothing but looked at her own children with a contemplative expression. Outside, Laura and Sophie felt a strange sense of liberation despite being enveloped in the cold November wind. Laura's car slowly left the residential area and headed toward Main Street. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, silently staring out the window. Her small profile showed a depth of thought unusual for a 10-year-old. "I'm sorry, Sophie," Laura said when they stopped at a traffic light. "I never meant for you to experience something like that." Sophie turned to her mother. "It's not your fault, Mom. Grandma's just being mean." At those honest words, Laura's expression became a mixture of laughter and tears. "You must be hungry. Shall we go somewhere to eat?" They decided to stop at the Bluebird, a popular local diner. It was one of the few places open on Thanksgiving Day. The interior was unexpectedly busy, and they were shown to a small booth by the wall. In the classic American diner atmosphere, a Thanksgiving special menu was being offered. "Hello, everyone out on Thanksgiving." Doris, an elderly waitress with a warm smile, greeted them. She was a regular patient at Laura's hospital. "Just some circumstances," Laura answered simply. Doris seemed to sense something from their demeanor. "Today's turkey dinner is excellent, and I'll throw in some pumpkin pie on the house too." As warm food was laid out on the table, Sophie's expression brightened. Laura took out her cell phone and sent a message to James, "Decided not to stay at my parents' house. I'll explain later. We're at the Bluebird." Halfway through the meal, Sophie suddenly spoke up. "Mom, I wrote that note to Grandma myself." Laura stopped her chopsticks in surprise. "What did you write?" "Grandma, why do you hate Mom?" "Mom is always crying. But we are strong," Sophie recited as if she had memorized it. "I've seen Mom crying several times after phone calls." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes. It pained her to know that her daughter had noticed her suffering and was trying to protect her. She leaned across the table and embraced Sophie. "You really are a strong girl," Laura said, burying her face in her daughter's hair. "Mom can keep going because of you." Her cell phone rang, but Laura didn't answer. She only checked the message from James in a meeting, but is something wrong? "Can't leave right away, but I'm worried." She sent a brief reply explaining the situation. "You don't need to go to my parents' house. We'll spend time at the diner, at Margaret and Henry's house." Thanksgiving dinner continued in a strange atmosphere. Margaret tried to hide the note Sophie had given her under the table, but Laura's Aunt Clara noticed. "Margaret, what's that?" "It's what Sophie gave you, isn't it?" "Just a drawing." Margaret tried to cover up, but Clara had already taken the note. She put on her reading glasses and read the contents aloud. "Grandma, why do you hate Mom?" "Mom is always crying, but we are strong." Silence spread across the dining table. All the relatives couldn't suppress their varied reactions. Rachel covered her face with both hands, and her husband, Daniel, leaned back in his chair uncomfortably. Henry finally stood up. Something that had been suppressed for years was burning in his eyes. "This has gone too far, Margaret." His voice was quiet but filled with strong determination. "Laura is our daughter. Sophie is our granddaughter, and yet I what?" Margaret responded defensively. "She's the one who broke family tradition, marrying that man, living separately without divorcing. She's a family disgrace." Disgrace? Clara raised her voice. Margaret, you should be ashamed of yourself, making that child and Sophie sit at a side table. As your longtime friend, I must say this is too cruel. The room divided into two opinions. Some relatives supported Margaret, while others showed discomfort. 12-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lily looked at their parents with confused expressions. Mom, why don't we ever play with Sophie? Lily suddenly asked. You always just say another time. Rachel couldn't answer her daughter's question. In her heart, she had to admit that she too had been cold to her sister under her mother's influence. The meal continued in silence. Around the time dessert was served, the doorbell rang. When Henry opened the door, James was standing there. He looked a bit tired in his business suit, but greeted politely. Hello, Henry. Where are Laura and Sophie? They've already left. Henry stumbled over his words. James's expression clouded. What happened? Henry led James to the living room. Margaret looked at her husband unpleasantly but didn't want to cause more issues in front of the relatives. James entered the living room and greeted everyone, but he immediately sensed the heaviness in the air. Laura's Aunt Clara stood up and began explaining what had happened that day without reservation about the side table, the cold food, and Sophie's note. Read this. Clara handed him the note. After reading it, James's face changed. His usually calm expression was filled with anger and disappointment. He gently folded the note and put it in his pocket. Is this how you treat your daughter and granddaughter? James quietly but sternly looked at Margaret. It's not my fault she separated from you, Margaret retorted. This isn't about our marriage. James's voice was low and trembling with controlled anger. I absolutely cannot forgive treating my wife and daughter this way. Do you understand how much Laura has been hurt? And now Sophie is feeling that pain too? Margaret tried to make excuses again, but James raised his hand to stop her. That's enough, he said resolutely. If you can't cherish Laura and Sophie, then our family relationship ends here. He slightly bowed his head to all the relatives, said, Excuse me, and left. Those remaining in the room were at a loss for words. Henry passed by Margaret, briefly saying, I'm going too. He took his coat and left his wife of many years behind. Back in his car, James sat with his eyes closed, still gripping the steering wheel. He called Laura, but there was no answer. Instead, he sent a text message, heading to the Bluebird. Please wait for me. As he started the car, he could see in his rearview mirror that Margaret was standing at the entrance, watching him leave, but she was no longer his concern. His heart was full of thoughts about his wife and daughter, who must still be hurting at this moment. Margaret returned to the house and took her seat for dessert. She tried to act as if nothing had changed, but everything had already changed. Laura's apartment living room was filled with the warm aroma of takeout food from the Bluebird. Sophie sat nestled next to James on the sofa, eating the cake he had brought. Laura's cell phone on the coffee table kept ringing incessantly. The screen displayed notification after notification, missed call from Mom, call from Rachel, call from Henry, call from unknown number, but Laura made no attempt to respond to any of them. Aren't you going to answer? James asked, looking at her intently. Laura shrugged with a relaxed appearance. Just for today, I want to cherish our time together. She returned from the kitchen with hot chocolate. 3 mugs floated with small marshmallows. Dad, will you be here tomorrow too? Sophie asked hopefully. James glanced at Laura. Yes, of course, Laura answered with a smile. If Dad doesn't mind, actually. James straightened his posture with a slightly nervous look. Laura, Sophie, there's something I want to talk about. He took a small envelope from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. This is a reservation confirmation. I've decided to end my apartment lease in San Diego next month. I'm planning to move back here. Really? Sophie nearly jumped up. Only if you two are okay with it. James carefully chose his words. I want to end our separation and try again. Laura was speechless. After 5 years of separation, she hadn't expected a reconciliation proposal to come in this form. My couch is always available, she finally joked. but tears shone in her eyes. Sophie went back and forth between her parents, hugging them both. Best Thanksgiving ever. The three continued their small, impromptu Thanksgiving party until late at night. Laura laughed from her heart for the first time in a long while James told funny stories about work, and Sophie talked about her adventures at school. All calls from the outside world were sent to voicemail. The next morning, Laura woke up to the sound of James and Sophie making pancakes. It had been the most peaceful sleep she'd had in a long time. Just as she was about to enter the kitchen, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Laura said, tightening her bathrobe as she headed for the door. When she opened it, Henry was standing there with a tired expression. He looked like he hadn't slept all night. "Dad?" Laura said in surprise. "Can we talk?" Henry's voice was small and thin. Laura invited her father into the living room. James and Sophie peeked out from the kitchen and greeted Henry. After a slight hesitation, Sophie went to hug her grandfather. "I'll make some coffee," Laura said as Henry sat down. He exhaled deeply. "First, let me apologize for yesterday and for everything before." He clasped his hands and placed them on his knees. For the first time, he looked like an insecure old man. "For years, I wanted to be free from Margaret's control, but I lacked courage. I yielded to my wife's demands and couldn't protect you." Laura silently listened to her father's words. A mixture of anger, sadness, and empathy swirled within her. "Sophie's note, it resonated with me," Henry continued. "That child saw the truth, how unfairly Margaret has treated you and how I couldn't stop it. Last night, for the first time, I didn't go home," he admitted, somewhat embarrassed. "I stayed at a hotel and thought all night. Laura, I should have protected you more." Tears fell from his eyes. In his 67 years of life, Laura had never seen Henry cry in front of others. "Dad," she searched for words, "I've blamed you too, but now I understand that Mom also had issues." James brought coffee and quietly joined the conversation. "Henry, Laura, and Sophie are wonderful people. Don't you think they deserve to be cherished by their family?" Henry nodded. "Of course. That's why I want to change. I'm going to reconsider my relationship with Margaret too. She's suffering as well. Her mother did the same things to her." At those words, Laura was prompted to consider the background of her mother's behavior for the first time. A chain of hatred, she thought. About a week later, an unexpected visitor appeared. Saturday afternoon, shortly after Sophie returned from ballet lessons, Margaret was standing at the door of Laura's apartment. She looked smaller than usual and held a small paper bag in her hand. "May I come in?" Margaret's voice was different from her usual confident tone. Laura silently invited her mother in. When Sophie saw her grandmother, she half hid behind James. "What do you want?" Laura asked, crossing her arms. "Your embarrassing behavior caused." Margaret habitually began to blame, but her expression soon softened. "No, that's not it. Grandma." Sophie suddenly stepped forward. "Don't hurt Mom." Her eyes gazed straight at Margaret. The pure sense of justice of a child and a sharper insight than adults was evident in her expression. For the first time, disturbance was visible in Margaret's eyes. She knelt before Sophie, meeting her gaze. Grandma might have been wrong. James had been silently watching the situation, but here he quietly said, "Sophie sees the truth. She's much wiser than us adults." Margaret slowly stood up and offered the paper bag she had brought to Laura. "This is for Sophie." A hand-knitted sweater. "I knitted it myself." Laura was surprised. She had never heard of her mother knitting by hand. "Your mother, that is." "My mother was cold to me too," Margaret quietly confessed. "Family honor and appearance were everything, and I was taught that expressions of affection were signs of weakness." In her words, Laura glimpsed the wounds within her mother for the first time. Margaret hadn't completely changed, but at least she had begun to reconsider her actions. "Don't think this resolves everything," Laura said frankly, "but if you want to build a relationship with Sophie, welcome." Margaret gave a small nod. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but a small step had been taken. Laura looked toward James and Sophie. They stood by her side, offering silent support. "You are my real family," she said in a small voice. The three hugged tightly, and Margaret watched them from a distance. On Thanksgiving morning a year later, Laura's apartment was filled with the sounds of busy preparations in the kitchen. James was preparing a large turkey, and Sophie was setting the table in the living room. Outside the window, Boston's first snow was quietly beginning to fall. "Which tablecloth is better, blue or white?" Sophie asked, holding different colored cloths in both hands. Now 11 years old, she had grown a bit taller over the year and had a confident expression. "Blue would be lovely," Laura answered from the sofa. Beside her was a phone, as she had just finished calling the last guest to confirm. James and Laura officially reconciled 3 months ago, and James was granted a transfer to the local office of his construction company. Their relationship was stronger than before, having learned to respect each other's differences. Sophie couldn't hide her joy at having both parents together. The doorbell rang, and when Laura opened it, Henry was standing there. In his hands were a bouquet and wine. "Dad, you're early," Laura warmly welcomed her father. Henry had changed greatly over the year. He had finally learned to live according to his own will, resumed his hobby of photography, and joined a local photography club. His relationship with Margaret had also changed, and though they still lived together, it was gradually shifting toward a more equal partnership. "Where's Margaret?" James poked his head out from the kitchen. "She'll be here soon," Henry answered. "She's a bit nervous." Margaret had initially said she wouldn't participate in this year's Thanksgiving, but ultimately decided to come alone. She hadn't completely changed, but she had started attending psychological counseling once a week and was confronting her behavioral patterns. The doorbell rang again, and this time Rachel and her family arrived. Since last Thanksgiving, Rachel had also begun to reflect on her actions. Her dependence on her parents had decreased, and she was working on repairing her relationship with Laura. "It's been a while," Rachel smiled awkwardly. Repairing the sisterly relationship was taking time, but at least dialogue had begun. Later in the afternoon, Margaret arrived as the last guest. She carried a small gift bag and was dressed more casually than usual. "Sorry I'm late," she said somewhat hesitantly. When Sophie saw her grandmother, she ran to her without hesitation and hugged her. "Grandma, I'm so glad you came." A surprised and joyful expression appeared on Margaret's face. She gave Sophie the gift bag. Inside were a handmade scarf and a small note that read, "Grandma can change too." Before the meal began, everyone sat at the same table, and Sophie was asked to say words of thanks. She started in a small voice, but gradually began to speak with confidence. "I'm thankful that Grandma has started to change, that Grandpa has become stronger, that Mom is smiling again, that Dad has come back, and that we can all be together." Laura had tears in her eyes at her daughter's words, and James put his arm around her shoulder. Across the table, Henry was gently holding Margaret's hand. Tears also shone in Margaret's eyes. Everyone sat at the same table, and warm mashed potatoes were distributed to all. There's no such thing as a perfect family anywhere, but wounded hearts were gradually healing, and new bonds were being formed. That was the true meaning of this Thanksgiving.